Hi, good morning. Good morning. Good morning, Harvard. Hi. Welcome again. Just a quick announcement. As I said, this class you can take pass-fail. By the way, the PowerPoints are on some of you may have seen it on the website, and what you can do is just download it to your computer and then print it out as you wish. And it will be on every time before class, usually the night before at the latest. You can take this class pass-fail, and you can have it, I can sign it, or Jessica or Sean can sign it for you. Are there any questions before I go on? Any technical, mechanical, biological, psychological? Yes?
I was wondering if you could put in a word for getting wireless here.
If I can what? Wireless, so that if I'm boring you can surf the web? I know, I was a student too. I'll ask Barry after. Okay. SMS, messages, emails, recorded. You know, you can actually put a camera on and your mom can watch it at home. You know, the options are limitless. But I will ask, yes. And any other questions? I guess not. All right, so I had a little bit of a scare last week. Most of you don't know, I mean, all the TFs do, but you don't know. I was very ill last week, and the only way I could get through this class was, you know, basically completely drugged. You know, no wonder I had such a good time. You know, Jeff brought me some amazing chicken soup. Highly recommend if you're ever ill, just call him. The best. But I really wasn't well, and Friday finally, you know, I wasn't teaching, so I could go to the doctor. And I went to the doctor and you know, did all the customary ah and ooh, and they took a blood sample. And they said, you know, we're not sure, it may be mono, but it turned out not to be, fortunately. But they sent me home. Now for three days I literally hadn't slept, and when I slept I was delirious and, you know, not really knowing what was going on. And finally on Friday night I fell asleep at around 9 p.m. At midnight my wife wakes me up, and again it takes me a while to orient myself, and she said, look, the doctor just called, the lab results had just come in, you know, from blood, and she wants you to go to the emergency room immediately. And she said you have to go to Beth Israel because that's the best hospital. And she recounts the discussion. She said to the doctor, look, you know, he fell asleep finally after 3 nights. You know, can he go in the morning? And she said, no, absolutely not. He has to go right now. So as you can imagine, you know, we're slightly worried. And we don't want to wake up David, our baby, so we call a cab. Tammy stays home with David, and I get into the cab. I'm still shivering, you know, freezing and worried. And you know, the cab goes. I live down by Huron, by the quad. And, you know, drives down, goes up the river. I look at Harvard on my left, and I look at Boston in front of me, and I can't help thinking. I try to have positive thoughts, positive psychology, but I really tried, believe me. But I said, you know, what if this is it? You know, what if I have 1 year left here? What would I want to do? You know, this is a question that I ask theoretically once in a while, but here it had a little bit more emotion stuck to it, unfortunately. And I feel very, sad, wistful. I won't see David grow up. Won't have other babies that I could see grow up. Won't spend more time with my lovely wife and family, and won't be doing the things that I love to do. And then I turned to the professional side, and I said, professionally, what would I want to do in this 1 year if I had just 1 year left? And the first thing that came to mind was, I would want to leave behind a coherent document or something that would bring together my ideas of positive psychology, that would communicate positive psychology to others as I understand it, so that others can see the benefits of it, the greatness of it, and the wonder of it. This is what came to mind today on that taxi ride. Anyway, so I get to the hospital. He drops me off at Beth Israel at the wrong hospital, so I have to walk 3.5 blocks to the right, emergency room. Barely made it. Checked out throughout the night and all that, and finally it turned out to be a false alarm. They gave me antibiotics, said I'm not contagious anymore, and sent me home. But what I want to do today is share with you why is this the one thing that came to my mind as I said, what if I had 1 year? Why do I think positive psychology is so important? Why is it so important, I think, for Harvard students and for the world to know more about this fascinating and important field? This is what today's lecture is about. It also will explain why people like Marty Seligman, Phil Stone, Alan Langer saw this area as an area that has to become its own unique network of scholars. Why couldn't you just continue to be part of psychology as a whole? Well, one of the studies that had a lot of impact on the thinking in positive psychology was run by David Myers. David Myers, positive psychologist from Hope College, very appropriate name, looked at psychological abstracts. He ran this in 2000, so for 33 years. And he wanted to look how often certain topics, certain words appeared in these psychological abstracts. And here is what he found. The word anger, over 5,000 studies concerning anger. That's on PsycInfo for those of you who look it up. Anxiety, over 41,000 studies on this topic. Depression wins with close to 55,000 entries on PsycInfo, just in the abstract. Positives, 415 abstracts on joy. Happiness, over 1,700, compared to 41,000 on anxiety. And finally, the winner on the positive side, life satisfaction. It's a huge topic in psychology, over 2,000. That's a ratio between negative research and positive research. And again, I don't mean negative in the sense of bad, poor, sense of psychopathology as opposed to the positive psychology. The ratio is 21 to 1. This is the ratio that Marty Seligman looked at when he said, we need to create a network of scholars that will focus on studying positive things like joy, things like happiness, things like life satisfaction, like self-esteem, like relationships, love, friendship, like goal setting. Just so that there is more of a balance. Today and for the rest of the class, I'm not going to argue for there to stop being research on this. It is extremely important. But just for a shift of the pendulum. This phenomenon is not new, that psychology focuses on the negative. Here is Abraham Maslow back in the 50s. The science of psychology has been far more successful on the negative than on the positive side. It has revealed to us much about man's shortcomings, his illnesses, his sins, but little about his potentialities, his virtues, his achievable aspirations, or his psychological height. It is as if psychology had voluntarily restricted itself to only half its rightful jurisdiction, and that the darker, meaner half. There's a lot of research on violence, on anger, as you saw, on evil. Very little research on virtue, on goodness. And on Thursday, we'll talk about the importance of such research. Not just for its own sake, but also for bringing out the goodness in people and also for eradicating a lot of the evil and the negatives that we see around us. So Martin Seligman and company said we need to accentuate the positive. We need to focus on it much more. And toward this end, the aim of positive psychology is to catalyze a change in psychology from a preoccupation only with repairing the worst things in life to also building the best qualities in life. It's about life flourishing. It's about the flourishing individual. It's about the flourishing community, and it's about the flourishing society. What positive psychologists saw was that essentially psychology needs help. Why? Because imagine that in your life you were experiencing half an hour of joy during the day and 10 hours of depression on an ongoing basis, or 1 day of happiness and 21 days of anger. Unhealthy. Right? You would go and seek help, ideally. The field of psychology is in a similar predicament, but the question is this a good analogy, individual to a whole field? I don't know, because many people who say, no, we need to continue focusing on negative, quote-unquote, research, is that it reflects reality. We need to do all this research because there is so much anxiety and depression and anger and evil and violence. Plus, these are the things we want to eradicate, to get rid of. So we need to research these things. Especially given that, in many ways, it seems like it reflects, the ratio is not that far off from reality. And it's getting worse. 10 times higher today than it was in 1960. Now, part of it is because we're better at diagnosing it. There's higher levels of awareness. But still, it doesn't account for 10 times more. People are overall generally more depressed today than they were back then. Why? There are many reasons for it. One of them is the rat race, which we'll talk about a lot later. Lack of time. People are always stressed. So much to do, and so on. But we'll leave that for the rest of the semester. But that reflects reality. And of course we need more research on depression. Look at the situation. Mean age today is less than 15. With the information highway, kids have more access to things that kids didn't have a few years back. Whether it's the standards that they can't reach, whether it's the materialism or whatever it is, people have access to these things and they become depressed much more often. Also, how many 15-year-olds in my parents' generation spoke about depression? Very few. Today through the internet, much more educated for good and for ill. Right here at home. 12th of January, 2004. Depression at Harvard, over 80%, not over, 80% of Harvard students, according to the Crimson study, 80% were depressed. Now, this is not just feeling down. This is, feeling seriously down to the point of not being able to function at least once during the year. and that's for a period of weeks or months. It's very high. Plus, the other thing that this article identified was the rising levels of depression and anxiety and other mental illnesses on our campus right here. And what they said is we need more resources, and I'll talk about that later. More resources to deal with this phenomenon. So it's right here with us. Once again, I'm not talking just about the occasional down or I have few bad days. I mean, who doesn't have that? I mean, I felt down 10 times just yesterday. It's natural. The ups and downs, the vicissitudes, they're there. This is depression that people experience. In a study of 13,500 college students throughout the country, a huge sample, nearly 45% were depressed, seriously depressed, to the point of not being able to function over the last year. Over 94% feel overwhelmed or stressed. I talked about the connection between the two, stress and depression. That's unhealthy. And then people who defend negative psychology would say, look at these numbers. What are you talking about, positive psychology? We need to deal with these issues. No, this is an epidemic. We're not talking here, a couple of people. We need to put all our resources, all our minds, all the minds in William James or at the universities throughout the world need to focus on these problems. And they have a point. They have a real point here. This is again what I'm saying is not to do away with this research, which is important. But I want to shift the pendulum. The 21-to-1 ratio, I still argue, is unhealthy. Why do I think that? Why do I think we need more positive research? Why do I think we need to shift that pendulum? There are three reasons which I'll elaborate on today. First reason, psychology shouldn't just react to reality, to the status quo. It should also create a different reality, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Happiness, it's not just enough to get rid of depression or anxiety in order to be happy. Maybe a first step, but it's not enough. We need to actively pursue happiness, and that's why positive psychology is important, in order to give us the tools to do that. So even if we're not anxious or depressed, we still need to do more. And finally, we'll argue that positive psychology can also help in terms of prevention, in terms of helping us overcome depression, anxiety, neurosis, other psychopathologies. So these are the three things I'll argue for today. Let me begin with the first. You see, what's happening today with psychology is that unintentionally, psychologists are creating a downward spiral of unhappiness. In what sense? There's certainly a lot of negative experiences out there, as we saw. These numbers are staggering of anxiety and depression. These negative experiences, in turn, lead people to want to research these topics. They're important. Naturally, they want to research and study them. Also, NIH gives money to study these. But then what happens inadvertently is that this negative research is also reinforcing negative experiences, i.e. it's creating more depression and more anxiety. In a sense, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'll discuss it. This is, you see, because the thing is that what we focus on in reality, what we choose to focus on, very often becomes what we see out there. Let me explain further. You see, what positive psychology needs to do is to break this cycle. What it needs to do is to reverse it. Now, when I talk about the negative research, I'm not just talking about one or two studies on depression or anxiety. What I'm talking about is the obsession that exists today with the study on that, where you see most of the labs studying psychology, most of the NIH money goes to studying these things, and this creates a certain reality, reinforces the current predicament. Positive psychology is about reversing the spiral. You see, because if you have positive research, this will lead to more positive experiences, which in turn will lead to more positive research, and so on in an upward spiral of happiness. You know, it works a little bit like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Again, this is a very superficial explanation here. What does it say? It says that you cannot measure a phenomenon without affecting it. Right? You cannot go on and measure anxiety, depression, neurosis without actually affecting reality and bringing these things about even more. Similarly, for positive research, if you study happiness, greatness, virtue, wonder, awe, gratitude, you also bring these things out much more in reality. Human systems grow in the direction of what they persistently ask questions about. What are the research questions that positive psychology asks? What are the research questions that negative psychology asks? These questions make a lot of difference. I mean, think about it on a personal level. If someone comes to you and says, "Oh, you're depressed today?" versus, "Well, what are you so happy about?" Different questions will elicit a different response on the micro level, but also on the macro level of society. So this is the first reason. Psychology shouldn't just react to the reality, it should also create the reality, and therefore we need more positive psychology. The second thing why we need positive psychology, happiness is not just the negation of unhappiness. So there is this assumption today that if, let's just get rid of the depression, of the anxiety, of the neurosis, of the psychosis, or whatever it is, and then we'll be happy, and then people will be happier. But that's not the way it works. You see, look, take an analogy. Look, for, you have indigestion. Sure, you need to get rid of this indigestion before you can enjoy a gourmet meal. But getting rid of the indigestion in and of itself is not enough to enjoy Jeff's soup. Right? You need more than that. Getting rid of depression is not enough to be happy. And this is the assumption that a lot of psychology is under, which is why we see many people who are not necessarily depressed or anxious, but they go through life with a certain ennui, just some boredom, or if you want to take it a little bit more to the extreme, to use Thoreau's term, most men lead a life of quiet desperation. Okay, not really depressed, not overly sad, not anxious, but so what? And what psychology needs to do, what positive psychology needs to do, is take the next step. You see, you can look at our experiences on a continuum. Whereas on the negative side, you have things like neurosis, anger, anxiety, depression, psychosis, and on the positive side, well-being, satisfaction, joy, excitement, happiness. It's not enough. And this is what psychology has been doing mostly now, getting from negative to zero. We also need to get from 0 to 1. And psychology doesn't have really good answers for that yet. But this is why we need a positive psychology. And when we do have answers, most people don't know about it because it's not conventional wisdom yet. And this is what this course is about. To make this getting from 0 to the plus more accessible. There's two different models of conventional psychology, of negative psychology and positive psychology, of the disease model, where the goal is to get rid of disease, versus the health model, to get people to flourish. Very different approaches. Here are some examples. The disease model would focus on what am I bad at versus what am I good at. Again, overcoming deficiencies versus building on my competencies. We'll talk about this in this class also. 1508, we'll talk a lot about this. Run away from pain. Run away from that depression because it hurts. I know it hurts. Versus look for pleasure, for excitement, for the joy in life. Run away from unhappiness, pursue happiness. Now, these can manifest themselves in similar behaviors. You know, you can have a person working an 80-hour week. One person is running away from an unhappy relationship or from, doesn't want to deal with relationships, running away from their depression and just burying themselves at work for 80 hours a week. The other person can work for 80 hours a week and just love it. Can't wait to get to work in the morning and just suddenly looks at the clock and it's midnight already. So you can do the same thing, but from very different places. For the disease model, let's get to the zero so that I'm not ill versus an ongoing pursuit of happier and happier, higher levels of self-esteem, joy, excitement, and so on. A lifelong journey. And finally, just want to get to this tensionless state where I just don't really feel too bad versus I want to feel this excitement. I want to wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to get to work. Or in the evening, I can't wait to get home and see my girlfriend, wife, boyfriend, family, whatever. Very different ways of living. Now, which one do you choose? Because the choice has implications. And again, this choice is very often made on the subconscious level. And if the only thing we read about, again, if the gestalt, the reality that we face is negative research, anxiety, depression, then we say, I just don't want to have these things because they're terrible. And they are terrible. Again, I don't think there's one person in this room who hasn't experienced these things. Or do I say, I've experienced these things, they're part of human nature, I'll deal with them, or I am dealing with them, but I want more out of my life. I don't want there to be a glass ceiling. I want to feel excited about my work. I want to feel passionate about my relationships. I want to walk out and feel awe and gratitude. I want to be excited. I want more than the ennui or the boredom or and just another day or the rat race. The questions we ask very often determine our reality. Whether it's a research question in psychology or whether it's these questions that I just asked that we ask of ourselves. All right, let me move on to the third idea. So the first idea was that psychology shouldn't just react, it should also create reality. The second idea is that just getting rid of the negative is not enough. That's why we need a positive psychology to see how do we get from that zero to the positive. The third point, I think, is in many ways the most important one. You see, because positive psychology doesn't only help us to get from the zero to the plus, so that I say, once I get rid of my depression, then I can start pursuing my happiness. No. It says much more than that. It says that that it can prevent going below the zero if I cultivate things like strengths, things like virtue, self-esteem, my levels of happiness. And also I'll be able to better deal with my anxiety and depression when I do get there, if I have cultivated a strong positive psychology-related traits, again, such as self-esteem, happiness, and so on. So it's not just the zero to the plus, but it also has an impact on the other side of the equation. It very much has an impact on this side of the model. Here is why. You see, the two psychologies have a very different conception of illness. For positive psychology, illness is the absence of health. For general psychology, health is the absence of illness. Think about it for a second. The implications of this. This is not just semantics. You see, because what it's saying is that if we take away, or at least the positive psychology, what positive psychology is saying is that if we take away our striving for self-actualization, toward happiness, toward excitement, that's when we'll be unhealthy. In other words, in order to prevent ourselves from going below the zero, we need all the positive psychological elements. Look at Maslow, what he has to say, specifically about neurosis. And this applies, as he says, as research shows, to many other areas. But he's talking specifically about neurosis, which he defines as the failure of personal growth. Maslow. Neurosis, is a falling short of what one could have been, and even, one could say, of what one should have been, biologically speaking, that is, if one had grown and developed in an unimpeded way. Human and personal possibilities have been lost. The world has been narrowed, and so has consciousness. Capacities have been inhibited. So you see what he's saying? The reason why we get to the negative side is because we haven't cultivated the positive enough. This is very different from saying, I'm on the negative now, and I need to work on these negatives in order to eradicate them. Again, that's important when we're there. But no less important is to also develop the positive side. Again, he's not the only one who says it. Marty Seligman addresses this very issue. Let me read to you. In the last decade, psychologists have become concerned with prevention. It's a huge thing, those of you who have done research on it. How can we prevent problems like depression or substance abuse or schizophrenia in young people who are genetically vulnerable or who live in worlds that nurture these problems? We're talking about a lot of the at-risk population, which we'll discuss later. How can we prevent murderous schoolyard violence in children who have access to weapons, poor parental supervision, and a mean streak? What we've learned over 50 years is that the disease model does not move us closer to the prevention of these serious problems. Over the last 50 years, look at the research, it's getting even worse. Not only is it not helping. Now, I'm not blaming that kind of research for it not helping, but what it's showing is that there has to be something more. Indeed, the major strides in prevention have largely come from a perspective focused on systematically building competency, not correcting weakness. In other words, the health model rather than the disease model. He continues. We've discovered that there are human strengths that act as buffers against mental illness. Courage, future-mindedness, optimism, interpersonal skill, faith, work ethic, hope, honesty, perseverance, the capacity for flow and insight, to name several. We've shown that learning optimism prevents depression and anxiety in children and adults, roughly halving their incidence over the next 2 years. Similarly, I believe that if we wish to prevent drug abuse in teenagers who grow up in a neighborhood that puts them at risk, that the effective prevention is not remedial. Rather, it consists of identifying and amplifying the strength that these teens already have. What he's saying, positive psychology is saying, is that the best way to deal with all these issues, with schizophrenia, with depression, with anxiety, is to develop strengths, to cultivate self-esteem, optimism, all the things that we'll talk about this semester, all the things that positive psychology is concerned about. So going back, prevention through cultivation of the positive. What positive psychology does is that it strengthens, according to Seligman and according to a lot of research, it strengthens our immune system. In what way? Well, think about it this way. It's not the people who study positive psychology or who do positive psychology or who cultivate self-esteem and happiness and excitement and hope and awe, gratitude. It's not that they don't experience depression or anxiety. Not at all. I mean, it reminds me last year when I was teaching this class, I was still a resident tutor in Leverett House. One of the students who wasn't taking this class came to me and said, some of my roommates told me you're teaching a class on happiness. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, watch it, because if I see you depressed, I'm going to tell them. And I'm sure he told them many times, so over the semester. You see, the last thing I want you to think or to come out of this class with is to say, okay, now I can do positive psychology. I can avoid being depressed or anxious for the rest of my life. Not at all. Again, there are two kinds of people who don't experience anxiety, depression, and anger, and various other negative emotions. Two kinds of people. One, the psychopaths. Really, they don't experience these kind of emotions. The second group of people who don't experience these negative emotions are dead people. So if you experience depression and anxiety, it's a good thing. It means you're neither of the two. It's natural, it's human nature, we all go through these ups and downs. Now, what does it mean to have a strong immune system? Look on the physical level. Someone with a very strong immune system gets sick. Everyone does. But a strong immune system means he or she gets sick less often, and when they do get sick, they recover quicker. That's what a strong immune system does. This is what cultivating of these positive psychological attributes does. It strengthens our emotional immune system, and by the way, as we'll see throughout the semester with the connection between mind and body, it also strengthens our physical immune system. So that yes, we do feel depressed but less often, and when we do, we can recover quicker. And yes, we do get sick, but we recover faster as well. That's what positive psychology does. Stronger immune system. Let's come back to our local village. So what do we do here? Well, the Crimson article says we need much more resources. We need many more resources here at Harvard. And they have a point. We do need to focus more on mental health, but I think right now the resources don't go to the place where they should, or not fully. What do I mean? So yes, there is a lot of emphasis on the mental health center and helping students deal with depression and anxiety, and it's wonderful. And and I'm not belittling these. I think they should stay. The Bureau of Study Council, I've been there many times, and I recommended, those of you who've been to Leverett now, I've recommended it to many students. Wonderful resource. We're privileged to have it here. But it's not enough. It's only half the equation. Why isn't there a center at Harvard where people would go to identify their passions, what they're blissful about, what their personal strengths are that they can cultivate, their competencies? Why isn't there a happiness center at Harvard? It won't just help us get from the 0 to the 1, but also the prevention to help deal with a lot of the issues here. Again, this is one of the things that hopefully positive psychology will do. He's talking about exactly these things. So what am I passionate about? What do I really, really, really want to do with my life? What is there to be grateful about in the world? How can I improve my relationships? Certainly a place for that. Okay. Any questions before I move on to a case study? one of the most fascinating case studies within psychology to my mind. Any questions before? As I said in the first class, also email me questions. I'll always respond to them, either in person or in class. These are important issues. And the field, as you saw, unfortunately, it still is in its infancy. Yeah, yes, sorry. Yeah, it's a good question. I'll repeat it. So there are various schools of psychology. The humanistic, we talked about it last week, humanistic, behavioral, psychoanalytic, or psychodynamic. And what does positive psychology come out of? As we said last time, it mostly comes out of the humanistic. But the question is, does it form its own school? Like the humanistic psychologists did. And I don't know what will happen. Right now it's becoming a very big movement, its own movement. I hope it doesn't form its own school. I really hope it doesn't. I hope there's much more research on it and there's a network of scholars. But those of you who are taking the leadership class know, I'm against demarcation. I'm for the boundarylessness. I'm for there to be collaboration between the behavioral psychologists, between cognitive behavioral therapy, between psychoanalysis and positive psychology. I think that's when we can get the most. That's why, people say to me, I study psychopathology. Should I do positive psychology? I say, absolutely. Or my students say, look, I'm mostly interested in positive psychology. I'm not interested in, what is it, Psych 16? What's psychopathology? No, 18. 18? Yeah, 18. I'm not interested in psychopath. No, take it. It's important. The best ideas come, as we'll talk next time actually, when there isn't a demarcation among the fields. And you'll see in this course, we'll talk a lot, not just about what's narrowly defined as positive psychology. We need to reach out. This is why liberal arts education is so great. Because you do get, there are some computer scientists I know in this room who are taking this class. There are some people from math, and we take. It's important, this cross-fertilization for the field. This is where I hope it will go. I'm not sure whether that is what will happen. But my classes will always be that way, that's for sure. Any other questions? Yeah, you can also holler because evidently I can't see everything. All right, let me move on to a fascinating case study that shows the power of positive psychology. The at-risk population. So many Harvard students are concerned with this issue. So many of us volunteer to help the at-risk population. It's a huge problem in the US, an even bigger problem throughout the world. What do we do about it? Well, psychologists obviously ask these questions. And traditional psychology started asking it with earnest after World War II. And here is the question that traditional psychology asked. Why do these individuals fail? Why do so many, the statistics are staggering. Why do so many people from inner cities not finish high school, are on drugs? Why do so many of them then become dependent on the government? Why there's so much crime in these areas? What answers did they come up to this question? It's because of the poverty, the lack of resources, a lot of child abuse, broken families, poor education, and so on and so on and so on. A lot of answers to this. But then, in 1979, a seminal book came out by Antonovsky. It's on your recommended reading list. By the way, there's a recommended reading list at the end of each PowerPoint. You'll see when you download them. Antonovsky, who said, wait a minute, we shouldn't just look at the negative. This was back in 1979, long before positive psychology started. We have to ask different questions. And the positive psychological approach to this very same problem was not why do so many fail. Remember, to which the answers were, poverty and lack of resources and poor education and abuse. The question became, what makes some individuals succeed despite all these circumstances? Can you see the profound difference between these two questions? Can you see how a question creates reality? This, by the way, is not just a question for inner city kids. Let's bring it home. One question to ask is, why are so many people at Harvard depressed? Another question to ask is, what about those few people at Harvard who do experience it as an awe-inspiring 4 years, or who go through the day-to-day loving it, who don't just talk about the good old days 50 years hence, but are experiencing the good old days right now, every day, or most days, most moments. Different questions that yield different answers. This question, the positive psychological question, spawned the research on resilience, one of the most important research projects in the field of psychology. Here's the definition of resilience: a class of phenomena characterized by patterns of positive adaptation in the context of significant adversity or risk. By the way, a lot of this work I'm basing on work of one of my students from Leverage, was in my sophomore tutorial, Lucy Grayson. Has done wonderful work on resilience. So they did this research on resilience, and you also have more in your recommended reading list. And initially they said, these must be super kids, the select few, the 1 in 1,000 who's able to do it. What's unique about them genetically or something? What happened to differentiate them from the rest? But then after a while they started seeing that as more and more research accumulated, these were not super kids. These were normal kids with ordinary characteristics, but extraordinary results. I'm going to list now a few of the characteristics that they identified. They don't just apply to inner city kids. They apply to you and to me just as much. Ask yourself as I go through each one of them, how many of these do I cultivate? How many of these do I have? How many of these am I working on developing? Now, no one has all of them, and the resilient kids didn't have all of them, but they had a few that kept them going. 1, social support. They seeked social support when they had a bad day. They talked about their issues, their problems. They also talked about the great things in their lives, which, by the way, is equally important, as we'll discuss later in the semester. It's not just important to share our misery, it's also important to share our wonders. And by the way, women are better at it than men are, about seeking out social support, about looking for help, which partially explains why research shows, and we'll talk about it much more when we talk about relationships, in general, men benefit from marriage more than women do. True. Because women have already got the supportive friends, or most women. Again, this is generalization, and I'm talking about a trend rather than a one correlation. But it's true. Whereas men are less, or are more reluctant rather, to share. Whether it's something biological, whether it's the way we're brought up, I don't know, it's probably a bit of both. It's important to seek social support, but not from anyone. We need to find the right person. Let me show you an example of the wrong person to seek social support from. This video game makes a nice birthday gift. Do you think your stepson would like that?
I don't know, hon. Can he eat it or rub up against it?
Let's come at this a different way. What are his interests?
Ham.
Why don't I just let you browse a while?
Yeah, thanks. Oh, and do you think there's anything you could do about all these kids in here?
Ma'am, it's a toy store.
Yeah, see what you can do. Move it, shorty.
Hey, Karen, I can't help you shop today. I gotta go.
Hey, what's going on? What's happening? What's this against your hand?
Nothing. I just had something zapped at the dermatologist, and it looks kind of funky, and I just don't want anyone to see it right now.
Grace, I'm sure it's not nearly as bad as you think it is. It's probably nothing, a little dot. Come on, show Mama. I'm sorry. So how long have you had the herpes?
It's not herpes. It's not even herpes adjacent.
Oh, yeah? Well, it's close enough to be invited to the herpes family picnic.
It was a weird freckle, and the doctor wanted to freeze it. And then he told me that it was going to take 10 days to heal. I mean, what made him assume that I could look awful for 10 days? Respond to that, and I will rub it all over your product.
What are you looking at, Prego? Haven't you ever seen herpes before? Jeez, fat people are so insensitive.
Oh my God, would you look at it in this little toy mirror? It's gotten bigger. It's like Barbie's dreams it. Thank God I canceled my date with Mark.
Yeah, because that thing looks like it needs orange cones and police tape around it.
Come on, let's get out of here.
Yes, so be selective, right? Social support is critical. Another element that's critical is cultivating optimism and self-esteem. We're going to do a lot of that in this semester. It's one of the critical areas, one of the critical characteristics associated with resilience. Faith and a sense of meaning. For a lot of the kids and for a lot of people with resilience, it's religious faith, but not only. It's a sense of meaning, feeling that there is something purposeful, something that you really believe in and want to do with your life. Again, this is something that we're going to talk about throughout the semester. Pro-social behavior. Helping others actually helps ourselves. You know, half in jest in one of, just only half in jest, in one of my articles I once wrote, I said that giving to others has so many benefits that I can think of no more selfish act than a benevolent act. And there's some truth to that. I mean, we get so much out of helping people because what it does, especially to people who are in bad situations, is move us from helplessness to helpfulness. From helplessness to helpfulness. And it's a whole different mindset. Those people focus on their strengths. So what am I good at? Not what has my teacher told me that I can't do, but what can I do well, and then they cultivate these strengths. And then they also set goals. They think about the future. Why? Because that helps them deal with the very, very often negative past and a difficult past. And we're going to dedicate 2 classes to goal setting. Look at these. How many of these are you working on? How many of these can you work on? You cultivate, because these are the same things that help people get through the stressful Harvard experience, stressful job experience, stressful relationship experience, as well as the inner city. This is what helps people succeed. And look at the difference. It's because they asked a different question. No longer, why do so many fail? But rather, why do so many succeed? Why do those who succeed? And now you can take this and apply it to everyone else, just because of a different question, different research question. Another thing that was common to people with resilience was that they had a role model. This role model was very often someone that they knew in person, a teacher, a significant adult, a parent, a friend who was a bit older, but it was not always someone who was next to them. It could also be a fictional character, historical figure, athlete, but they had a role model who they emulated, and that often helped them get over difficult times. Let me share with you one of my role models. The role model because of whom I do what I do today, because of whom I teach. Her name is Marva Collins. Marva Collins was born in the 1930s in Alabama. Her father was African American, her mom Native American. She was born in a place there was a great deal of discrimination then. As she grew up, her father really believed in her, thought she could do well, saw her through school, and sent her to what was then considered the glass ceiling for Black or Native American women in these areas. He sent her to secretary school. She went to secretary school. She excelled there. She finished. She started working as a secretary. But then she said to herself, I want more from my life. I want a sense of meaning. And for me, a sense of meaning is in teaching. I want to become a teacher. At night, she went to school, and after years of working during the day, studying at night, she got her teacher certification. Marva Collins then got married and with her husband moved to Chicago. In Chicago, she joined the public school system. It was back in the 60s. For those of you who didn't know the reality then, with the public school system, the inner city, what it looked like was that there was a lot of crime, a lot of drugs, and more than anything, hopelessness. The only hope that the teachers really had for the students was that they finish school, that they graduate from elementary school so that they can keep them off the streets, because many of their role models were the drug pusher or the prostitute on the street corners. They wanted to keep them away from street gangs. This was their hope for the teachers. Marva Collins came in and said, things can be different. She started teaching initially first and second grade, later beyond. The first thing she said to the students coming in on the first day of class, the first thing that they heard from her was this: we are going to do a lot of believing in ourselves. She repeated this message over and over and over again like a broken record. She continued telling the students, it's up to you to succeed. Stop blaming other people. Stop blaming the government. Stop blaming the teachers. It's up to you to succeed. And you can succeed. You need to work hard. She pushed them very hard. We're going to do a lot of believing in ourselves over and over and over again. Miracles started to happen. These students, which were initially considered unteachable by most students, but by most teachers, were suddenly, by the time they were in 4th grade, reading Emerson and Euripides These students, once considered unteachable, were doing, by the time they were in 4th grade, high school math and reading Shakespeare. But then rumors started to spread about Marva Collins. Initially, the rumors were, well, she's fudging the grades. But then these students became more public. They gave readings in the school. So rumors started to spread about her, that she was beating up their students. Otherwise, how else could it be? After a while, she'd had enough, and she left the public school system and created her own school. In her home, initially in her kitchen. And there were 4 students in this school when it started. 2 of them, her own 2 children. After a while, more students came to the Marva Collins School. All the students that came in were students who failed from the public school system. The Marva Collins School was their last resort before the street. The school grew, she moved up. They had a room in the house, but then there was not enough space, and they moved to a shack in inner city Chicago. The shack in the winter was freezing. In the summer, scorching hot. They continued to study, driven by their passion to make something out of their lives, because they believed. Once again, the miracles continued. Not a single student dropped out of school. Everyone went to high school. Not a single student of hers, she was no longer teaching them, but not a single student of hers dropped out of high school. They all went to college. And Marva Collins continued to fight poverty throughout her life. What she did was, she didn't know how to raise money for this school. Many of these kids couldn't pay, and she didn't turn anyone away. Somehow she managed. She and her husband together, again driven by the passion. Finally, in 1980, someone with connections heard about the miracle of Marva Collins and reported it to the TV, and they created a 60-minute section on Marva Collins. Overnight, she became famous. January 1981, President Reagan offers Marva Collins to become the Secretary of Education. Marva Collins turns him down. She says, "I love to teach too much." 1989, January, George Bush Sr. offers her to be the Secretary of Education. She turns him down again. She says, "I love to teach too much." In 1995, a wealthy American, a philanthropist, donates $100 million. And now there are Marva Collins schools throughout the country. Hundreds and thousands of teachers come from all over the world to learn from Marva Collins, to learn about the Marva Collins miracle. Her students today are doctors, lawyers, business people, politicians, and more than anything, teachers, because they see what a teacher did for them, and they want to spread goodness. People come from all over the world and they study what Marva Collins does. And I want to share with you a little bit of Marva Collins, and you'll see her more throughout the semester. But she's going to be with us always, every class. She's going to come up, because in many ways she inspired what you're going to see throughout the semester. So Marva Collins. This is, by the way, an interview that she gave for the History Makers. It's about African Americans who made a great contribution to society, a great website, History Makers.
I think I am pretty wonderful. I think I am bright. I think I am unique. And I'll teach every child in here to think that. When they misbehave, their punishment is they have to write 100 reasons why they are too wonderful to do what they're doing. And that they have to be in alpha order. I'm adorable, I'm beautiful, I'm courageous. I give them the first ones until they get the hang of it. I'm delightful, I'm effervescent, I'm fabulous, I'm heavenly, I'm idolized, I'm just wonderful, I'm a kindred spirit, I am laudable, I am momentous, I am never indolent, and it goes on to Z. And if they do it again, then they have to use another synonym. They can't use adorable anymore. Now the children will say to new students, I don't know why you don't behave, because I'm tired of telling Mrs. Collins how wonderful I am.
Isn't she wonderful? Now, here's her book. For those of you interested in being teachers, if there is one book you want to read, it's this. For those of you interested in being parents, if there is one book you read, it should be this. For all the rest of you, if there is one book you want to read, really, I mean it. So what is her message? What is the secret of Marva Collins? Very simple. Remember we talked about in the first class, this is not very complex stuff. It's basic, but the basics are important. First of all, she provides them with role models. She herself is a role model, obviously, the role model. But then they study biographies. They study about great politicians. They study about people like Lincoln. They study about Martin Luther King. They study about Ayn Rand. They study about Rosa Parks. These are their role models. She provides them optimism and faith in themselves, not ignoring the difficult situation. She shifts them from blaming the government, blaming other people, blaming their parents, to take responsibility for their lives. It's up to you to succeed, is what she says to them over and over again. And finally, rather than focusing on weaknesses, she focuses on their strengths. So she looks at every kid and asks, what is that child good at? What can he or she excel at? And she accentuates it. Again, some of these questions we'll ask throughout the semester. Now there's a very different question, or different answers that the two questions suggest. Remember the two questions with the inner city kids, with the at-risk. She's working with at-risk population. All her schools work with at-risk population. Whether we ask, why are these kids, so many of these kids suffering or failing? Versus why do some succeed? Because if we ask the negative psychology question, the answer is, again, because there are not enough resources, abuse, family, or whatever it is. The answer to this question shows or depicts these people as victims of their circumstances. Right? Versus the Marva Collins question, the positive psychology question, which is, why do some of these succeed? And then we come up with resilience. It puts them as active agents. See how the question that we ask influences reality. Because if we see them as passive victims, what do? Well, we need to pour more money into these places. Not saying that it's not important, but that's not the answer. What else does this say? Well, poor them, all we can do is empathize and wait until the inner cities are better. Marva Collins doesn't have time to wait. She says we can make a difference right now on the first day of class when she tells these kids we're going to do a lot of believing in ourselves. Why? Because you can make a difference in your life and in the life of your community. You see, you can situate every activity on this continuum. You know, a politician can situate every activity on this continuum. And a politician will say, what do I need to do? And will come up with very different answers, seeing passive victims versus active agents. But also, in our day-to-day, let me take just a mundane, something that happened to probably every single person in this room, or most people in this room. Something that happened to me, unfortunately, one too many times. Let's say your girlfriend leaves you. Let's say. Don't let me relive it. So what the passive victim would say, that's terrible, it's awful. But very quickly, it will move from self-pity to blame. It's because of her, it's because of her parents, it's because of my parents, it's because of President Bush, it's because of President Summers, you know, he upset her with her. And you didn't video record this, did you? Good. My boss. And then it moves on to frustration and ultimately anger. Anger at her, anger at her parents, at my parents, at President Bush, President Summers, and so on. Look at the different conception if I have the active agent perception of the situation. Again, still feeling down, still feeling upset by it, certainly not happy. Human nature to experience the ups and downs, but much more confident about going out and doing something, taking responsibility for my predicament. Going out to a place and saying, all right, so I'm going to meet other women. Taking the initiative, going to Pinocchio's. Lamont. The philosophy library. No, don't go there. Just kidding, I was a philosophy concentrator. Much more hope and optimism. Again, still feeling upset, experiencing it, and ultimately possibly or much more likely to forgive and or forget. Move on with my life, as opposed to ruminate over my predicament passively. Not that I don't experience sadness, not that I don't cry. And we'll talk about the importance of expressing emotions, not just positive emotions, negative ones as well. But remember the strong immune system. I'm much more likely to get over it if I have a strong immune system. Okay. Let me end just with a quote by Marty Seligman, which will give us a sense of what we're doing here, what we're going to do the rest of this semester. The message of the positive psychology movement, just one minute. Just 1 minute. The message of the positive psychology movement is to remind our field that it has been deformed. Psychology is not just the study of disease, weakness, and damage. It also is the study of strength and virtue. Treatment is not fixing what is wrong. It's not just fixing what is wrong. It also is building what is right. Psychology is not just about illness or health. It is about work, education, insight, love, growth, and play. In this quest for what is best, positive psychology does not rely on wishful thinking, self-deception, or hand-waving. Instead, it tries to adapt what is best in the scientific method to the unique problem that human behavior presents in all its complexity. Remember what I talked about last time, but the difference between the humanistic and positive psychology is that positive psychology, and this goes also to answer to you, positive psychology takes the rigor and the fun and brings them together. And I can't wait for this semester to share the rigorous fun with you. See you next time.